So welcome everyone to a wonderful session here at Limmud NY, looking at the science of memory. It's called There Are Places I Remember, because I'm a Beatles fan and figure people know the Beatles. I don't know anyone who doesn't like the Beatles, but we talk about memory. And for those of you who might have been in my session last night, I think actually there's nobody here who was here last night, because they may be having breakfast here, but what we talked about last night is the integration of science and religion. That's my work. So I'm Jeff, I'm a rabbi, and I run an organization called Sinai and Synapses that does work about the bridging of the worlds of religion and science. And as I'm sure many of us know, many of us experience, that the conversation about science and religion in American society today is atrocious. It's really, really bad. There's a lot of people yelling back and forth and arguing about lots of different issues of evolution and creation or climate change. But in truth, many of the biggest questions that we face in our world, they're not scientific and they're not religious, they're human. So who am I? Why do I act the way that I do? What does it mean to be part of a community? And so one of the things that we do through Sinai and Synapses is we look at big questions where we can find some wisdom from religion. Where can we find some wisdom from science? And can we bring those together to really help us better understand ourselves and our world? And so our focus today is going to be on memory, because what could be more Jewish than memory? Hi, come on in. What could be more Jewish than memory? And there's all this wonderful research that's really come out in maybe the last 20 to 30 years about the science of memory. So what we're going to look at today is both the scientific and the religious perspectives about memory and how we can find both the knowledge and the insights from Judaism and Jewish tradition and the insights from memory, and how we can come together and be able to use the two of them as a goal to be able to try to have a better sense of who we are. So I want to start. It was very much the inspiration of this talk was a really wonderful book a few years ago by a guy named Joshua Foer. And he was training for the 2006 USA Memory Championship. And he wrote a book called Moonwalking with Einstein. And it's a great book, and it's called The Art and Science of Remembering Everything. And he actually, if I remember, he either won or finished in second place. But as he talked about, he said that when he was first starting to train, he had, in his words, an average memory at best. And this is his lines. Among the things I regularly forgot, where I put my car keys, where I put my car, for that matter, my girlfriend's birthday, our anniversary, and Valentine's Day, why I just opened the fridge, the year the Cowboys last won the Super Bowl, and to plug in my cell phone. I can definitely identify with that. Actually, I was having breakfast this morning, and I was about to go walk into my session. I said, oh my God, I forgot to bring the handouts to be able to come here. So I had to remember to be able to say, we remember, we forget. Our memories are fallible, we think. But it's actually much more nuanced than what we might expect. So what we're going to look at from this question of memory, and particularly both the scientific and Jewish perspectives of memory, is really asking three questions that we don't always think about when we're talking about memory. The first question is, why do we remember? What's the purpose of memory? The second question is, what do we remember? What are the things that we remember in our lives? And the third is going to be how. How do we remember? Those are the three questions that we're going to be looking at. The what, the why, and the how. So I want to start by talking about why do we remember. So I want to open this up here for all of you, is what is the purpose of memory? Why does memory even exist? And you can answer this from either a scientific or a Jewish perspective, but why do we remember? So survivability, right? There's everything in life comes back to evolutionary adaptation of how did it help us survive. So knowing, oh, right, this is where I'm going to experience this multiple times, and let me bring that in and be able to apply that here and now. That's terrific. So and I'm going to expand on that a little bit more. Thank you. Other thoughts? Why? Yeah, that it helps us, it puts ourselves in a larger context and being able to say, here's where I came from, here's where I'm going to be going to. Terrific. Yeah. So you're hitting on something that it's really the purpose of memory, and people have brought this up here. When we think about memory, in what time frame do we think? When we generally talk about memory, when we're talking about memory, do we think we're talking about present, past, or future? When we're talking about memory, which orientation do we think we're talking about? Past. It's not. Right? It's about the present and the future. Memory, because think about how many things have happened in the past that we don't remember. Right? Tons. So for example, what are some of the things that Judaism commands us to remember? Say that again, remember? Honor thy parents. So to remember to honor your parents, right? Yeah. Remember Shabbat. Remember Exodus from Egypt, and even more specifically Exodus from Egypt, but also remember that you were slaves in the land of Egypt. Yep. Why else do we remember? What else does Judaism command us to remember? Calendar. Yep. Shabbat, right? If you were to have all of these different Shabbat, holidays, remembering that you were the slaves in the land of Egypt, remembering all of these different things, would you be living a pretty full Jewish life if you remembered to do all of these things? Most people say, yeah, right? Like if that's your depending on, hi, come on in. Depending on your faith and your connection to the synagogue, and those are all, that's and in many ways a secondary question of if you're remembering to celebrate Shabbat, if you're remembering that you were slaves in the land of Egypt, you are living a fairly good Jewish life. But when you're living a Jewish life, you are living it day to day. Right? It's not, oh my goodness, we were slaves in the land of Egypt. Boy, isn't that awful. Why do we remember that we were slaves in the land of Egypt? What's that commandment for? Yeah. That we remember, and this is one of the lines, and this is the line that from a professor named Steve Jordans, says why? It's to bring the past into the present or the future. It's not to be able simply to think about this is what happened, but to use the past as a way, it is a tool to help us remember things when we need it. So when do you recognize that your cell phone is down at 8%? When you want to use it, right? That's when you want to be able to use it. And so what's interesting, and William, what you brought up about evolutionary history. So if you were to transplant yourself into the African savanna, what is the most important thing that you want to make sure that you do? But if you're living there 500,000 years ago, right? They didn't have sunscreen. The most important thing is so that's the second most. When you say safety, the most important thing is don't die, right? That's the most important thing. Don't die. Oh my God, the saber-toothed tiger almost mauled me there. I need to remember where that is. That's a very important piece. There's a fear is a great motivator. That if you have little kids, and I have a 4.5-year-old and a 2.5-year-old. When my 2.5-year-old went to turn on the stove one time, like, no, right? Fear, and he didn't really remember, but what did he get scared of? Mommy and Daddy grabbed him and pulled him far away. You want to make sure don't die. But actually, generally, your life was relatively safe. So the first thing is safety, don't die. So that's why memory is there. But you said, what's the other thing? So after the don't die, what's the next most important thing?
Survival, like getting food.
Getting food, right? So there are a couple of different things. So what's the easiest, simplest, safest way to get food? Is probably berries, nuts, gathering things there. But what's the potential downside of berries and nuts and things like that? Well, so partly there's no protein. I'm going to get to that in 1 second. They might be poisonous, right? You might get sick. They may not be ripe. So you've got to remember, right, this is when the berries come each year. This is where that fruit tree is that had the really good fruit. So even just remembering the very simple things to bring that, say, right, last year, last season, this is when the sun goes up in this area and it's this temperature, it feels like this, that's when I'm going to go get my berries. But protein, so here's now, and we're going to get to the community piece of this here. So protein, what is the best source of protein on the African savanna? Deer, or so even more generally than that? Game, animals, right? What's the problem of trying to get animals? So some of them run fast, and what's the other problem with the other kinds of animals? They could eat you, right? So there is a risk of trying to get protein, and meat has tremendous value. There's meat and there's fat in animals, but there's a great risk in trying to be able to get the animals here. So where is the best place to store meat? Let's say you've got you're in the African savanna. Where is the best place? You've brought the gazelle down. Where is the best place you can store it 300,000 years ago in the African savanna? Did they have smoking? Did they have smokehouses and refrigeration? No. So you couldn't, right? And store it in other people's stomach. The best place to store the food, right? Because let's say the three of us go on a hunting trip and the three of you go on a hunting trip and one of us succeeds and one of us fails, right? Then, I have too much meat. I can share it with you and you can then survive for a little bit of time. But there's another risk here when it comes to this question of community, because you might actually just sort of let us do all the work and you'll take all the credit here. So what a lot of sociologists and anthropologists have discovered, not sociologists, but anthropologists and scientists have discovered, that one reason that our brains are so big is not because we can use tools, a little bit because of language, but because the number of people that we can remember that we have some sort of social connection with. We're the people, you helped me, you stiffed me. I need to remember this person is very helpful. This person knows how to be able to take this animal down. It is what most scientists think right now is that we can remember about 150 people. 150 people which is about the number of people that you would feel comfortable calling to have over for a casual dinner party. Not all at once, but people that you would feel comfortable to sit down with and talk to. Which is why, by the way, if you're in a synagogue, right? If you're in a 1,200 family synagogue, what do they all have? Chavarot. Right? Because you can build those, because you're building those kinds of connections. Why? Because you can remember who people are and what their connection is. And that memory and relationships, we store memories in other people, particularly. There was a very interesting thing of one theory as to why particularly divorce and death are so devastating for spouses when a partner is lost, is that we tend to store our memories in other people. If you're partnered with somebody, you have a shared memory with that person, and you also who knows how to change the dishwasher, who knows how to pay the bills, who knows how to be able to do X or Y or Z. When that person dies or leaves by divorce, you've actually lost part of yourself in that kind of way. So being able to know, this is what I'm thinking, this is how I'm interacting. Memory is not just individual, memory is communal, which is why in Judaism, it is a communal responsibility. Remember, all of you, remember that you were slaves in the land of Egypt, and remember individually as well. We tend to actually outsource our memories. So most of my memories are here. And probably for you also. If you are trying to schedule an appointment, I will put this in my phone and then we'll not look at it until the next couple days. So we will actually outsource a lot of our memory to be able to say, this is what I'm looking at. And I'll actually every day, Facebook will say, here's what happened on this day. And I look at it every day to see what happened on February, what's today, 18th, 19th? I don't even know what day. I've forgotten what day it is. But I look to see what happened at this time because it also helps me connect to what's happened in the past and inform who I am right now. So, and that raises an interesting question of how do we remember the different what are the relationships that we actually have as a quality of relationship versus quantity of relationship, and memory and technology is changing that interaction as well. There's a reason, by the way, that most of the things that we are scared of as humans, um, snakes, spiders tend to be scary for people. Heights, the things that we tend to be scared of. Why do we tend to be innately scared of those things? They can get killed, and particularly because they were very dangerous up in the trees when we were up in the Africans. Even when we were primates, that was a place where you could get hurt. And monkeys actually have different calls to be able to say, this is what you need to be careful of this. And again, it's a danger piece to say, remember that we can do that. And what's interesting too about memory as well, we'll talk about this when we talk about the how, that one of the things that drives memory is an emotional reaction. The things that actually implants us to be able to say, if there's something emotional, either positive or negative, I need to remember it. That's sort of the rule of thumb that we have in this kind of way. So I want to just finish on this little bit of why do we remember here. Because one of the wonderful lines, as I said, was this idea of that we remember to be able to bring the past into the present or the future. That we try to say, here's what happened, and I want to be able to have this impact me here and now. So I'm going to move to the next little piece of what do we remember. We ready to move on to the next question here? Okay. So we're going to do a memory test. Don't worry. Don't write any of these words down. Just listen and try to remember them as best as you can. Molehill, horn, peak, melody, plane, band, top, radio, summit, sing, climb, piano, valley, sound, hill, note. So just let those sit for a few minutes. We'll come back to it. So what prompts us to remember some things and not others? So sound, and actually often multiple modalities. So sound, but what's actually the most primal sense? Smell, right? So if you go in to the house where you grew up, you like instantly brings you back, right? You can smell that, and I'm going to come back to this. So, and by the way, if you were at the communal Havdalah, I don't know if it was Isaac who was the person who was leading the Havdalah. He said Havdalah is the ritual that will save the Jewish people. Why is Havdalah so popular and so powerful? And I don't know anyone who doesn't love Havdalah, because it hits all the senses, right? You see the candle, and you smell the spices, and you taste the wine, and you hear the music. And very often when you're in Havdalah, right, you're in a very closed space. You got arms around it. There's a physicality to it. So Havdalah hits all five senses there. So that's a big part of that. So there's a theory that's exactly right. There's a theory called the Velcro theory of memory that I particularly love. So why does Velcro work? It's sticky. Well, why does it stick? It's not a hook and eye connection. It's multiple hooks and eyes, right? If there's just one hook, then it may or may not stick. But when there's multiple hooks, that's what's going to make it stay there. And so I sometimes talk about that we need the Judaism theory of Velcro, the Velcro theory of Jewish memory here, and for education, because when we're teaching kids, very often there's just sort of one hook that the kids might have on there and just slides right down. But if we can start by saying, where are the hooks that already exist in our brain, and then bring Judaism onto that, then it sticks. So the more connections we can have. I don't know about you, I don't necessarily remember all my passwords because there's one. But when does it help us remember? What helps you remember a password? Like a question, right? An answer that you know the answer to, right? right? Some way that you say like, oh, right, here's the prompt that's going to be able to say that. If it's just a string of letters and numbers, you're not going to remember it. But if you remember what was your grandmother's maiden name, there are more connections there. What else prompts us to remember things, some things and not others? Things that we enjoy, right? So both things that we enjoy and sometimes, yeah, we don't always get to control what we're going to remember there. That's right. That's a different piece there. Yes. So there's a whole theory, and this is an amazing piece of how does the past use the present and future. There's a guy named Daniel Kahneman who won the Nobel Prize, and I apologize for talking about this at 9:15 in the morning, but this was the example. This is the classic example that he uses. It's called the peak end rule. That you tend to remember the beginning. You want to grab people there, but what people really remember is the intensity and how things end. So this was maybe 20 years ago that he did this. That there was a particular type of medical procedure that was rather uncomfortable but very important for men after the age of 50. They had to have colonoscopies. Again, apologize for talking about this at 9:15 in the morning. So what they did, this was really before anesthesia. And a colonoscopy was very helpful because it prevented cancer and had all sorts of health benefits there. But nobody wants to actually go have a colonoscopy. It's not a pleasant experience. So they tried different things. And they asked people, here's person A, and they asked people on the time, and this is the intensity, and this was how much time they spent on it. Intensity of how much pain is there on a scale of 1 to 10. So they did a picture of this. So the first people, it started off slow, and it went to high, and then it ended there. And the second people, it ended there. Okay? So, which group experienced objectively more pain? The first group or the second group? Second group, right? By definition, right? Because this one went on for another 5 minutes or 10 minutes longer. But what was the difference between number 1 and number 2? Right, where it ended. So they asked people, are you willing to have a follow-up appointment? This group was significantly more willing to go and have a follow-up appointment than this group, because what they remembered was that it wasn't as bad. So when you're trying to think of how do I create an experience, you want to make sure what is the most intense piece and how do people remember it? What's the end? So that's also why there was a wonderful piece that someone said, nobody ends a Shabbat service with the sermon. How do we end a service? Adon Olam, Yigdal, something, and say Shalom, and what kind of music do we tend to end with? Up, happy, and ones that, right? Is there any chazanut that happens at the end of a service? No. How do we end a service? Everyone sing, right? Because you want people going to the Yonah going, yeah, no, or whatever song it is. You want to be able to end with that kind of sense there. So absolutely, we remember things based on how they end. Any other thoughts as to what prompts us to remember some things and not others? Yeah, Felicia. Yes, indeed. It's the oh boy, it's a fallacy, and I'm blanking. I don't remember. So yeah, selective memory, and you're trying to be able to confirmation bias. Confirmation bias. That's what it's called. Confirmation bias of being able to say, I want to find the things that are going to. So we'll remember all the things that either confirmed us or there's a great article from a few years ago. By a psychologist named Daniel Gilbert called Whoever Cast the First Stone Probably Didn't. We tend to remember the hurts that have been done to us, but we don't remember the hurts we do to other people. And so that's a big part of this. There was a wonderful study that was done about people being asked, do you remember when you were a kid and you went to Disney World and met Bugs Bunny? Oh, I totally remember that. Why is that a problem? Bugs Bunny's not a Disney character, but they were so sure that they had this wonderful time. But the emotional piece of that, and that's an interesting, that's how we're going to end a little bit of the emotional piece is critical, but It's not always accurate. So thank you for. So one thing that people often say when I do this presentation, they say, what prompts you to remember some things and not others? Sometimes people will say something that's really important, and I will say, are you sure? Right? How many important things do we not remember? The very first time I taught this, and now it's actually dated because so much has happened politically since then, but you may remember this. The first time I taught this was in November of 2011. So it was the Republican primary debates, and there were lots of people. There was a nationally televised debate there, and our current Secretary of Energy, Rick Perry, was there, and they said, what would you do if you were president? And he said, I'm going to eliminate 3 departments of the federal government: health, education, and oops, was what he said. He said health, education, and oops. He couldn't remember. It's a nationally televised presidential debate. You would think if it was important, he would remember it. But that's not how memory works. How many different important things? Oh my God, I forgot, right? There's a reason that we say, oh my God, I forgot. So the reason, what prompts us to remember some things and not others? There's a professor named Daniel Willingham who says, what prompts us to remember some things and not others? We remember what we think about. As he says, your memory lays its bets this way. If you think about something carefully, you'll probably have to think about it again, so it should be stored. Thus, your memory is not a product of what you want to remember or what you try to remember. It's a product of what you think about. Or, to put it another way, memory is the residue of thought. And that's why there are so many ways to be able to say, and mitzvot, to be able to say, remember these things, to think about them. Remember that you were slaves in the land of Egypt. How many times do we have that as a mitzvah? Why do we, although I don't normally wear them, why do we have tzitzit? Remember the mitzvot. Why do we have to say remember the mitzvot? Because you might forget them, right? The only reason you say remember something is you might forget them. So you have a cue to be able to say, let me remember this here. Remember that you were slaves in the land of Egypt. The other wonderful line that I love that really put this in captures this guy Steve Jordan's again, who said that when you remember someone or something, you're breathing a little life into them. Which is why it's a wonderful image for me of Kaddish, of remember and Yartzeit, of when you're remembering someone, they are alive. In some capacity, you are breathing a little bit of life into them. So what do we remember? And that's why, if you belong to a synagogue, you probably noticed, by the way, that how often do you get a reminder from the synagogue, an automated of the Yartzeit of so-and-so is coming up on February 7th. Make sure that you come. Why does that happen? Right, you might forget, right, because you're busy. We've got other things. And then, by the way, how does the synagogue know that? Right, and but they keep that record in the computer system. And how do they find it? They look at the computer, but you had to enter it in, right? So it becomes a loop. Which, by the way, and this is why, Karen, when you were talking about Facebook, and there's technology that actually can be very helpful, because you want to be able to remember your loved one. You want to be able to do that. That is a value. But we do forget. So being able to outsource that and say, I'm going to rely on the synagogue, or I'm going to rely on my phone to be able to do that. Is it as good as being able to say, I always remembered my mother, always remember my father? Maybe yes, maybe no. But this way you are ensuring to be able to bring that past into the present of the future. Technology changes us. And our phones and the internet are definitely changing our brains. For me, the jury's still out of whether it's good or bad. And I don't think it's universally bad. I don't think it's universally good. I think it is changing. And I don't quite know how it's all going to shake out. But I think it is undeniable that technology has changed the way that we're able to remember things. There was an interesting article that I just read a couple weeks ago, said, I've forgotten how to read. Now, it doesn't mean that I become illiterate, but I've noticed this, that it's harder for me to be able to focus on a book than I used to be able to do that. But I also am reading much more than I had been 10 years ago because it's shorter pieces, but I have a much more diverse piece of what I'm reading. So again, there are trade-offs that are happening here. Yeah. Absolutely, and I think that's and again the multiple different senses. For me, as somebody who listens to a lot of music, and when I can remember oh right, this is where I was, both physically in terms of space and time when this song came on, or when I was listening to this particular musical or whatever it is. That there's the definitely experience influences memory, and to be able to say memory, and a lot of people say X or Y changes your brain. On some level, that's actually a non-statement because everything changes your brain. It's a question of how. And experience, though, is definitely a large way in which we create those memories here. So there's a question. One thing actually, when I talk about what does Judaism command us to remember, it didn't come up here. Sometimes it does. Is the Shoah. And there's two reasons in the Jewish community now, and it's changing slightly as to why we are trying to remember the Shoah. Several years ago, 15, 20, 30 years ago, the reason of remember the Shoah was to remember all the people who died because we had a much more direct connection. It was parents. It was generally often parents or even siblings. Now it's shifted to be able to say, remember the Shoah so that it doesn't happen again. There's not as much a direct connection, but it is both of those pieces to be able to say, I want to keep those people alive because there's nobody to say Kaddish for them. And I want to be able to say, I want to make sure this does not happen again to other people. So I want to come back. You may or may not have remembered those words that I read. So here's what we're going to be able to do. Here's what now I'm not going to ask you to repeat all of them, but here's what I want you to be able to do. I want to see how much life you breathed into the words that I read about 15 minutes ago. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to say a couple of words, and I want you to raise your hand if you think the word was on that list. And then after that, I want you to, on a scale of 1 to 5, how certain you are. So 1 is, I'm not so sure. 5 is absolutely, totally.
So we raise the number?
So yeah, so we'll say, raise your hand if you say, if you think the word was on the list. And then the next round is going to be, on a scale of 1 to 5, how sure you are. So 1 is, I don't know. 5 is absolutely. So the first word is table. Raise your hand if you think table was on the list. Okay, no one thought table was on the list. How sure are you on a scale of 1 to 5? Okay, I'm gonna say how correct everyone is at the end. All right, table. Okay, good. All right, melody. Raise your hand if you thought melody was on the list. Okay, raise your hand. Okay, and how sure are you that melody was on the list? Lots of 5s. Okay, good. Thank you. How snooze? Nobody thought snooze was on the list. All right, how sure are you on a scale of 1 to 5? Okay, good. Next word, music. How many of you think music was on the list? All right, nobody thinks music was on the list. All right, how sure are you on a scale of 1 to 5? 5, okay. And the last word is mountain. How sure are you that mountain? How many of you thought mountain was on the list? All right, on a scale of 1 to 5, how sure are you? 2, 3, 5, and okay. So, there was actually only one word that was on that list. And that word was? Melody. Music and mountain were not on that list. Right, so peak and so right. So let's unpack this a little bit. And actually, by the way, whether you got it right or wrong, you got it right because we'll talk about that. That if you got it wrong, you got it wrong for the right reason. So why was this why were people not quite as sure? Because people were like, absolutely, table's not. But with music and mountain, I saw a lot of people going, maybe like the others like yes or no. Sometimes actually when I do this, people are, yes, mountain was absolutely on the list. And I say, it wasn't? They're like, it wasn't. No, it was. I totally heard it. It was there. So why would somebody, we talk about our memory not working of forgetting things, but sometimes we remember things that weren't there. Peak was on that list. So it wasn't just peak. What were the other words that came up? Right? Summit. So And so why was the word music coming up there so much? So I was alternating different words that had something to do with peak, with mountains, or with music. There were a couple of other pieces here too. How many words was I reading? A lot. Did you say too many? 20. Yeah, I don't know exactly. I have to look to see how many, but certainly my guess is what my experience has been that many of you at the beginning, because you didn't know how many words I was going to be reading, you started by saying, all right, I'm going to remember this. And by the time I got to about word 4 or 5 or 6, you just went, forget it. And then tried to say, let me try to bring these together. There's clearly a link here. These are all words that have to do with mountain. These are all words that have to do with music. I'm just going to lighten my cognitive load and just forget about it and offload that memory there. There's a study called the magic number 7 plus or minus 2. We can remember about 7 units as a whole. And that's why, by the way, when you say your phone number, you don't ever say 3, 8, 4, 6, right? You phrase it in chunks there. So we remember, and so we remember the things that actually make sense together. Because the other reason that this works, how often are you talking about sound and melody and piano, and you're not talking about music? Right? Never. When are you going to be talking about molehill and valley and peak and summit and not be talking about mountains? So this is one of the things that when we're studying Torah, for example, sometimes a lot of Torah study, particularly when you get to like Leviticus, you get into the details, and it becomes like, why am I reading all of these names over? Why am I reading all of these halachot about purity and the priesthood? And why? One of the things that you can be able to do is say, let me go to the 30,000 foot range. What's the big idea? What am I trying to, because you see that your brain naturally will do that. So trying to, when it becomes frustrating of, I'm not going to remember all this, and try to zoom up and try to be able to say, what's this really about? Because ultimately, it's trying to bring that into the present or the future. All the laws of Leviticus, all the Hilchot of Shabbat, why? Well, I have to remember this, remember that. Why? Because I want to bring that into my life currently, at this moment right now. Before we move to this third piece, I just want to open this up for other thoughts or questions that are coming up. Yeah, so there are a couple of tricks. Certainly mnemonics is helpful. There's a wonder, this came up in Moonwalking with Einstein. They call it the memory palace. Particularly if you have a list, which is, we are very good at remembering spatial places. So if you can remember, and there's a whole piece of being able to do this, of going in order in like your house, of like starting the first item you're going to put at the front step of your door, and the second item you're going to put in the entryway, and the third item you're going to put in the kitchen, and the fourth item you're going to put in the wherever, like you can walk through. Because however you tend to walk through, or what's the drive that are your landmarks that you drive on the way to and from work, being able to link those in that kind of way. But certainly being able to I think that actually using technology to be able to offload is very helpful. To be able to say, when I set up a meeting and somebody says, I want to meet with you in 3 weeks, I put that meeting in my phone right now, and then I look at it there. Yeah. Assigned seating can be helpful because it allows you to remember where your students are. But there's a lot of research that says that if you sit in the same place, it creates literally a fixed perspective. So trying to be able to force people to sit not where they're comfortable, for the first few days to be able to do that, but mix that in. But if you notice, if you tend to sit somewhere in a classroom or a meeting, everyone has their seat where they sit. But if you happen to be running the meeting, if you put name tags, people will sit wherever their name is. And I've never had any pushback on that. And it allows them, particularly if you're running a board meeting, you want to be encouraging different perspectives. That's a way to be able to do that. There's a whole discussion and conversation about how and why we remember things when we're younger. We tend to be much more formative in our younger pieces and then get harder as it gets older. We have about about 10 to 15 minutes, so I want to make sure we get to this last little piece because I also want to look at one tiny piece of text. But I want to look at this question of how do we remember? Because we've looked at why we remember. We remember to bring the past and the present to the future. We remember what we think about. How do we remember? So researchers actually say that there are 3 different kinds of ways that we remember when we talk about remembering. We talk about, one is called procedural memory. We're not going to talk about that much other than to say that's how you do things. You probably don't remember how you learned to drive, but you did when you were young. But once you learned it, it became muscle memory and you're fine, right? So like, that's all we're going to talk about with procedural memory. There's 2 other different types of memory, though. And I want to highlight these by giving an example. The first is what's called semantic memory. And this is what semantic memory is. What's 5 times 4? 20. Okay. Now, the other is called episodic memory. I want you to remember who you sat with at dinner last night. Take a moment. Just remember. Okay. Everyone remember that? Did that feel different to be able to remember who you had dinner with last night as it was to be able to say what's 5 times 4? Right? When you were trying to, what did it feel like when you were trying to remember what's 5 times 4? It was instant. Semantic memory is what is recalled. It's like a database, and I want to pull this. Episodic memory is reconstructed. It probably felt like you had a little video going in your head, right? Like, okay, here's where I was sitting. I was in purple 1, and I was sitting next to this person here, and it felt like you were actually reconstructing it in a lot of ways. Now, if we're reconstructing, it comes back to this question of it's not always necessarily going to be accurate. Because when we're reconstructing, what tends to happen is either we'll fill in the now. So one thing that often tends to happen is that we always think that we're going to feel the way we're feeling right now. We might have forgotten how sad or happy we were 10 or 20 years or 10 or 20 weeks or however long ago. Or if we're in a happy or sad place, we think we're always going to feel that way without realizing that in the future we're going to feel differently. So we tend to feel differently. And the other piece too is that episode, and this comes back, Jennifer, that what often tends to happen. I know this. There's what happened, but this happens definitely in families, right? There's not just what happened, there's the story of what happened, and then there's the story of what happened, and the story of the story of the story of what happened, and that becomes the truth. If you were to have a DVR, that may or may not be actually what is accurate, but what becomes encoded is not just the story, but the family lore that's happened all around. So when we're talking about memory, it's very emotional, it's reconstructed, and it's not always accurate. And so with that, I want to actually take a couple of minutes to look at a text that's connected to what we're going to be celebrating in just a few weeks, which is the story of Purim. There's a great line from Rabbi Brad Artson who says that there's actually great value in forgetting something, because when you forget something, you've got to re-engage with it. So when you're studying Torah, you're actually supposed to forget Torah, because if you forget Torah, it forces you to re-remember it and re-engage with that. And technologies, and again, we were talking about this of there is a technology of storing memories in other people. That is a technology in a very technical sense. There is value in saying, I know I'm going to forget this. So let me set a structure now so that I don't forget this. I need to make sure that I bring these handouts here. When this session starts, I need to make sure my sessions are here. I may forget that. What can I do to prevent that from happening? This is something that I'll be talking about a little bit tomorrow, about the difference between present self and future self, and there's a tension there. So I'm happy to talk about that more. I want to make sure that we talk a little bit about Amalek. So Amalek, do people know the story of Amalek? Some yes, some no. So Amalek, and the reason we read Amalek around Purim is that who is the bad guy in Purim? Haman. So Haman is the descendant of a guy named Agag. Agag is the descendant of Amalek. And that's why, and it says actually twice in the Torah, we're to blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. Remember that you are supposed to forget. That's why you do the Grogger on Purim. So first of all, it's a wonderful contradiction that says remember to forget. So Amalek is designed to be able to say, blot out the name from under heaven. And it talks about in Deuteronomy why we're supposed to blot out the name of Amalek. So why is Amalek so awful in this Deuteronomy text? What does he do? Right. He attacks from behind, and he attacks and that's the crux of the story, right? It's not, because the Israelites fight lots and lots of people, but Amalek in Deuteronomy, he is awful because he attacks the weak. Let's look at the story as it's told in Exodus, in Shemot, in chapter 17. Starting in verse 8, so it's 4 paragraphs down, right? There's no discussion in Exodus about Amalek attacking the weary. That's the whole point of the Deuteronomy text, right? You would think that if it's the same story for the same reason, that would be, somewhere in the story from Exodus, if that's the main point of it. So why does the story get changed? Why is it a different description here? And I have my own argument as to why that is. So what is the emotional state that the Israelites are in at this point? They're thirsty. They're tired. They're frustrated. They've actually, by the way, just crossed the Red Sea. This is literally like the first thing that happens afterwards. I'm tired. I'm hungry. Someone once said the whole book of Exodus through Deuteronomy can be summarized in 6 sentences. God complains about the Israelites complain about God, Moses complains about God complains about Moses, the Israelites complain about God, and God complains about the Israelites. That's Exodus through Deuteronomy. There's a lot of complaining that goes on. So the Israelites are in a bad place, and they're so frustrated. And what happens is they're frustrated and tired and are not thinking straight. Well, they turn on Moses, and then Amalek attacks. And so when they tell the story later, it then becomes a retelling of, it's not that we were tired, it's their fault. They did it. The Amalekites, they came and attacked us. It's not that we were in a bad, we got up on the wrong side of the bed this morning. They did it. How often how often in memory is it because we can't actually own our own failings, own our own emotions, and put the blame on somebody else? We reconstruct the story. Memory is not always accurate. And very often we tell a story where we are the innocent side and the other side is the guilty one. What's interesting and what's important here of this is that this is reconstructed. Which also means that we can then reconstruct the story of why, boy, I really messed up here. I'm so sorry about that. Maybe you had a point too. There was one of my teachers, Rabbi Michael Marmer, once said that we often tend to see the Mordechai in ourselves on the Amalek in someone else. What's much harder and much more important is to find the Amalek inside of us and own it and see the Mordechai in someone else. Because when we're arguing, when we're trying to see how, because memory is ultimately designed to be able to do something for us. Sometimes it's insidious to be able to say, I'm right, or this is how it was. But sometimes it's a way to be able to say, you know what? I don't have the ultimate objective truth on this. This is my story. I can own my story, and I don't have to apologize for this is my story, but I also need to recognize someone else might have a story. And I'm not remembering this to be able to say this is what it was, but I'm remembering to be able to do something else, to be able to achieve another goal. And what that also means is that we can tell other stories about loved ones, about Shabbat, about remembering that we were slaves in the land of Egypt. How do we want to reconstruct? What is the story we want to tell? We get to be the authors of our story, not individually, often as a community. And to be able to say, how can we reconstruct a story? If it's a bad story, can we edit it? Can we change it? Can we change the ending? Because when we talked about the peak end rule here, can we reorient what's happened to us? And can we think about it? Can we really own what we've done that's wrong? And can we really own what's been wonderful? And then can we make sure that we bring that past into the present or the future so that we can be living a fulfilling and meaningful life? With that, I want to thank you for taking some time to be able to learn this morning.